The night air along the coast of Coronado carried a damp chill, the kind that clung to uniforms and weighed heavy on unspoken thoughts, but Emily Hart didn't mind. She had grown used to waiting in the shadows, unseen and underestimated, because that was what came with being just a SEAL's helper. The men on the base didn't bother to hide their smirks when they passed her in the hallways, and the younger recruits laughed behind her back whenever she carried training gear or hauled medical kits to the shoreline. They saw her as a glorified assistant, someone tagging along the edges of greatness but never meant to stand inside it. What they didn't know was that Emily had lived her entire life in proximity to silence, learning to build her strength in the quiet places where no applause existed. Her brother, Lieutenant Marcus Hart, had been one of the most respected Navy SEALs of his generation, a man whose reputation carried weight even in rooms full of warriors, but Marcus had been killed 2 years ago during an operation that no one outside the classified circle was allowed to discuss. Emily had joined the support staff not to bask in borrowed glory, but because it was the closest she could come to continuing his legacy. She was no SEAL, and she had no illusions about becoming one, but she absorbed their rhythm, their harsh drills, their uncompromising culture of discipline, and she kept Marcus's memory alive with each step. She never complained, never broke under the men's dismissive laughter, but every night she returned to her small quarters with the ache of unspoken words pressing against her chest. She told herself she was strong enough, but strength, she knew, wasn't measured in medals or muscles. It was in the willingness to carry weight without anyone seeing it. That evening, the team was preparing for one of their grueling dawn swims, the kind where even the toughest operators muttered curses under their breath. Emily had arrived early, setting out hydration packs, monitoring the safety equipment, and making sure the medic kits were double-checked. She kept her movements efficient, quiet, invisible, as she had trained herself to do. A group of SEAL candidates lounged nearby, their banter loud and laced with mockery. "Hey Hart," one of them called, not bothering to use her first name. "Make sure you fold those towels right. The way we like them. Nice and neat." Another chimed in, "Yeah, she's basically the unit's maid. I mean, what else do you call a SEAL's helper?" Their laughter was sharp and careless, carrying over the water, and Emily forced herself not to flinch. She had heard worse. She bent down, tied the straps on the rescue raft, and whispered to herself words Marcus used to say before missions. "Steady, steady, the ocean doesn't care if you're loud, it only respects those who endure." She felt the sting in her eyes, but she held it back. Showing pain was a luxury. When Commander Reese strode onto the beach, the chatter died down. Reese was a man whose presence carved silence into any room, his reputation nearly mythic among the teams. He gave Emily the briefest nod of acknowledgement as he scanned the lineup, then barked orders for the candidates to form up. Emily stepped aside, unseen again, and watched as the group moved into position. Reese explained the parameters of the swim, the safety zones, the cold exposure limits, and then without looking directly at her, he said, "Hart, you're with me in the chase boat." Eyes open, same as always. There was no favoritism in his tone, just simple fact, but Emily felt a flicker of vindication. The boat duty was demanding, it required constant vigilance, sharp reflexes, and the ability to anticipate danger before it unfolded. Reese trusted her with that role, even if the others couldn't see why. The waves were rough that morning, slapping against the swimmers as they pushed into the surf. Emily sat on the edge of the boat, eyes scanning the horizon, recording times, noting body language, ready to throw the rescue line if anyone faltered. She felt alive in those moments, her pulse steady, her breathing calm. Out here, there was no mockery, only the rhythm of the sea and the discipline of duty. But when one of the candidates started cramping, thrashing in the water, Emily didn't hesitate. She vaulted over the side of the boat, the cold slicing into her skin like knives, and powered her strokes toward him. He was bigger than she was, heavier, his panic threatening to drag them both under, but Emily had trained in rescue technique for years. She locked her arm around his chest, tightened her grip, and shouted through clenched teeth, "Calm down. Breathe, I've got you." With sharp kicks she steered them back toward the boat, muscles burning, lungs straining, but she never loosened her hold. By the time Reese and another SEAL hauled them both over the side, the candidate was coughing seawater and staring at her with wide, stunned eyes. Emily collapsed against the deck, trembling with cold, but her gaze was steady. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The beach was silent when the boat returned. The candidates who had laughed earlier now watched her in wordless shock. Reese ordered everyone to attention, and as they stood in formation, dripping wet, shivering under the rising sun, he did something no one expected. He turned to Emily, squared his shoulders, and gave her a crisp salute. For a moment the world seemed to still. The sound of the waves faded, the gulls overhead went unnoticed, and every pair of eyes fixed on the woman they had mocked. Emily stood frozen, her throat tight, and then slowly she returned the salute, her hand trembling but precise. Reese dropped his arm and said to the formation, "Don't ever mistake support for weakness. She carries weight you don't even see. And today she carried one of your own." No one laughed after that. The silence was heavier than any insult, and for the first time since Marcus's death, Emily felt her brother's presence in the air around her. Not as a shadow she was chasing, but as a fire she carried forward. The salute lingered in Emily's mind long after the sun had burned away the morning chill. She had returned to her quarters soaked and exhausted, but sleep never came. She replayed the moment over and over, Commander Reese's unwavering eyes, the precision of his salute, the stunned silence of the candidates who had once mocked her. 4 years she had endured being dismissed, reduced to the role of a background figure, a helper carrying gear and keeping lists. She had told herself it didn't matter, that her purpose was quiet service and not recognition. Yet in that single gesture, Reese had shattered the invisible barrier that kept her confined to the margins. For the first time she realized they had seen her, not just as Marcus's sister, not as some hanger-on, but as a person who had earned her place among them. She thought of Marcus that night, his laughter, his impossible standards, the way he used to say, "Respect is not given, it's taken when you refuse to bend." For so long she had believed she wasn't strong enough to demand it. Now she wondered if she had been wrong. The next day the air on base felt different. The candidates avoided their usual mocking remarks, but it wasn't simply out of guilt. It was something heavier, a recognition that unsettled them more than any lecture. Emily kept to her duties, quietly efficient as always, but now eyes followed her. During equipment checks, no one dared to cut corners under her watch. When she carried the first aid kit into the training yard, the recruits instinctively stepped aside, giving her space they had never granted before. The respect was awkward, hesitant, but it was real. Reese, however, never mentioned the salute again. He didn't need to. His style was never about repetition but about impact. A single act once done was enough. Emily appreciated that. To speak of it would have cheapened it. Later that week, a new training evolution was scheduled, one known for breaking candidates who thought they had already pushed themselves to the edge. It involved a 24-hour endurance test that blended land navigation, ocean swims, timed runs, and survival scenarios designed to strip away ego. Emily's role was to monitor the medical side, keeping tabs on core temperatures, heart rates, and hydration levels. She had shadowed this evolution before, but this time she felt different, less like a silent observer and more like a guardian watching over warriors who might one day call her an equal. When the operation began, the candidates surged forward with the reckless energy of youth, but Emily noticed the signs of strain earlier than they did. The way one recruit's gait staggered subtly, the pallor spreading across another's face, the tremor in a hand that tried to mask exhaustion. She logged the details with meticulous precision, knowing that small cracks could shatter lives if ignored. Hours dragged into night, and the ocean turned merciless under the black sky. The men carried heavy packs through freezing surf, bodies crumpling against the waves. Emily rowed alongside in the safety boat, scanning each swimmer with eyes sharpened by instinct. When one man drifted too far, she was the first to spot it, shouting coordinates before anyone else noticed. When another began to falter, she tossed the rescue line with unerring accuracy, hauling him in before panic could claim him. The seasoned SEALs on the support crew exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement that this helper had sharper instincts than some of the men training to wear the trident. Still, Emily said nothing. Her satisfaction wasn't in proving them wrong but in keeping every man alive. That was her quiet victory. But at dawn the evolution took a darker turn. One of the stronger candidates, a man known for arrogance as much as stamina, collapsed on the sand after completing a timed run. At first he waved off concern, insisting he was fine, but Emily's eyes locked onto the subtle twitch in his lips, the unfocused stare, the way his skin burned too hot despite the cold air. Heatstroke, she realized instantly, and if untreated it could kill him. Without hesitation she sprinted to his side, shouting for ice packs, stripping away his gear with efficient urgency. The candidate cursed and fought her, too proud to admit weakness, but Emily's voice cut through his haze. "You stay still or you don't wake up. Your choice." Her tone carried no hesitation, only authority, and for the first time the man obeyed. She worked relentlessly, cooling his core temperature, stabilizing his breathing, her hands steady even as adrenaline roared in her veins. By the time the medic team arrived, she had already pulled him back from the edge. Reese crouched beside her, studying the scene, and then gave a curt nod. Textbook. You just saved his life. The word spread through the ranks like wildfire. By the afternoon, every candidate knew what Emily had done. There were no mocking jokes now, no sideways smirks. Instead there was a heavy silence, the kind born not of guilt but of awe. Emily walked among them unnoticed before, but now heads turned as she passed. They whispered in low voices, not derision but respect, as though speaking too loudly might diminish what they had witnessed. She remained humble, keeping her eyes down, but inside she felt something she hadn't in years. Marcus would have been proud. That evening, when the men stood in formation for debrief, Reese addressed them with his usual bluntness. He spoke of endurance, of pain, of the necessity of vigilance in the field. Then his gaze shifted briefly to Emily, standing off to the side with her clipboard, and he said, "A SEAL doesn't survive because of his muscles. He survives because of the people who refuse to let him die. Some of you have yet to understand that. She does." The men followed his eyes, and without instruction, a ripple passed through the formation. One by one, shoulders squared, and a collective respect hung in the air so thick it was almost tangible. No one dared to laugh anymore because the lesson had been burned into them deeper than any physical trial. To dismiss someone who carried the weight of life itself was to misunderstand what it meant to serve. And though Emily said nothing, though she kept her quiet place at the edge of the spotlight, she knew something irreversible had shifted. They could never unsee what they had seen. The weeks that followed were different in a way Emily had never imagined possible. The mockery had vanished, replaced with an unspoken respect that seemed to deepen with every passing drill, and though no one openly admitted their change of heart, the silence around her was now heavy with acknowledgement. She moved through the compound with her usual efficiency, but now the candidates made room for her, their eyes tracking her with the wary recognition usually reserved for instructors. It was strange, surreal even, to no longer be invisible. Yet Emily carried it lightly, never demanding more than she needed, never stepping beyond her role. She knew respect earned in the SEAL community was fragile, easily lost if arrogance crept in, so she kept herself anchored in the same discipline Marcus had taught her. Do the work, let the work speak. Still there was no denying the shift. Even the older operators, men hardened by decades of service, nodded when she passed, a subtle gesture that carried more weight than any medal. One morning, as the sun crawled over the horizon and painted the Pacific in gold, Commander Reese summoned Emily to his office. She entered quietly, her posture straight, hands folded behind her back as she waited. Reese looked up from his desk, his expression as unreadable as always, but there was something in his eyes, something deliberate, measured. "Hart," he said, voice low but firm, "you've been noticed." Emily blinked, unsure what he meant, and Reese leaned back in his chair. "Not just here. Higher up." The words hit her harder than she expected. Higher up meant command, the kind of people who rarely concern themselves with the lives of support staff. Reese studied her face, then continued. "They want you to participate in a joint exercise next month. Observer role officially. But between you and me, it'll be more than that." Emily felt her breath hitch, though she forced her features to remain neutral. "Why me, sir?" she asked carefully. Reese's lips twitched in the barest ghost of a smile. "Because you've proven something most of these men haven't yet grasped. You don't need a trident on your chest to hold this team together. You've earned the right to stand where they stand." His words carried no softness, only fact, and that made them all the more powerful. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes, sir." The exercise was brutal even by SEAL standards, a joint simulation involving air, sea, and land components, designed to mimic the chaos of combat. Emily was briefed alongside the operators, issued gear, and assigned to the medical rotation. The candidates watched in stunned silence as she suited up with the same calm precision she always carried, the webbing of her vest tight, the straps of her pack pulled snug. She wasn't pretending to be one of them, she wasn't chasing glory, but her very presence among the lineup sent an unspoken message. She belonged. When the helicopters lifted off and the roar of rotors swallowed their thoughts, Emily's heart pounded not with fear but with a strange, electric clarity. She thought of Marcus again, his voice echoing in her memory, and she whispered under her breath, "I'm here, brother. I made it." The first phase tested endurance under fire. Blanks cracked through the air, explosions shook the earth, and smoke swallowed the landscape. Emily moved with the unit, her eyes scanning for injuries, her hands ready to spring into action. Twice she dragged a candidate out of the kill zone when his ankle buckled, shielding him with her own body as simulated gunfire rattled around them. Another time she spotted the signs of hypothermia in a man pulled from the surf, forcing warm packs against his chest even as her own body shook from the cold. She didn't falter, didn't hesitate, and each time she acted, the respect around her grew thicker. By the time the team regrouped at the staging point, sweat and seawater soaking every stitch of fabric, Emily's presence was no longer questioned. She was part of the team. But it was during the night phase that everything changed forever. The unit had been tasked with infiltrating a mock enemy compound deep in the canyons, navigating through treacherous terrain under cover of darkness. The candidates were exhausted, nerves frayed, but they pressed forward. Emily moved silently at the rear, eyes sharp despite the fatigue clawing at her body. Halfway through the canyon, disaster struck. A misstep sent one of the men tumbling down a jagged slope, his cry muffled by the roar of rushing water below. Without a thought, Emily sprinted after him, sliding down the rocks, ignoring the sharp sting of cuts opening on her skin. She reached him just as the current threatened to sweep him away. The candidate was bleeding from a deep gash in his leg, his face pale with shock. "Don't move," Emily commanded, her voice firm, steady. She tore open her pack, working with precision despite the chaos. Tourniquet on, wound packed, vital signs checked. Her movements were automatic, drilled into her by years of training she had absorbed like oxygen. The man clutched her arm, eyes wide with fear. "I thought I was done," he rasped. Emily shook her head. "Not while I'm here." It took nearly 20 minutes for the rest of the team to haul them both back up the slope, but by the time they reached safety, the candidate was stable. Emily's arms were trembling, her body screaming with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with unyielding fire. Reese looked at her in the dim glow of red light, and though he said nothing, the slight dip of his head spoke volumes. When the exercise finally ended at dawn, the men lined up for final formation, their bodies battered, their spirits raw. Reese addressed them with his usual brevity, outlining failures and lessons learned, but then he paused, his gaze shifting once more to Emily. Without a word, he raised his hand in salute. The entire formation followed. Hundreds of arms rose in unison, the sound of fabric snapping sharp in the morning air. Emily stood stunned, her chest tightening, her eyes burning. Slowly, with hands that trembled despite her iron will, she returned the salute. It wasn't just Reese this time. It was everyone. And in that moment, she knew Marcus was watching, smiling somewhere in the silence. The salute from the entire formation haunted Emily for days afterward, not like a ghost that unsettled her but like a fire that refused to go out. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the rows of hardened men and worn-down candidates, all standing with perfect precision, all raising their hands in acknowledgement of someone they had once mocked as an outsider. The echo of that collective gesture stayed with her longer than any words could. She moved through the base quietly as always, but now the atmosphere around her was transformed. When she walked into the gear room, conversation stopped until she had what she needed. When she stepped onto the training beach, eyes snapped to her with the kind of instinctive respect reserved for seasoned warriors. Even the candidates who had once ridiculed her now deferred to her without hesitation, waiting for her instructions during medical drills, eager to prove themselves under her watchful eyes. Emily did not bask in it, nor did she allow herself to soften under it. Respect was not a trophy to be clutched, it was a responsibility to carry. And though she never sought leadership, she was beginning to realize that leadership had found her. Commander Reese, ever the stoic, didn't change his behavior toward her. He didn't shower her with praise or treat her differently, but there was a subtle shift, a weight in his tone when he addressed her, a deliberate acknowledgement in front of others that carried more impact than any medal. One afternoon, after a grueling surf torture drill where candidates shivered in icy waves for hours, Reese caught her eye as she moved among the men, checking vitals, pushing warm packs into their hands, whispering steadying words that kept them from quitting. Later, when the candidates were dismissed, Reese said quietly, "You've got something they don't teach. Don't waste it." Emily nodded, unsure how to respond, but the words etched themselves into her mind. As the weeks turned into months, whispers began to spread beyond Coronado. Stories about the SEAL's helper who wasn't just a helper reached other units. It wasn't official, it wasn't written down in any report, but word of mouth in the military carried further than formal memos. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, others as a morale story meant to inspire, but those who had trained alongside her knew the truth. Emily remained grounded, unaffected by rumors, but she could feel the shift in the air. She was no longer invisible, and with visibility came something far heavier than mockery: expectation. Her first true test came during an unexpected crisis. A training dive off the coast went wrong when a rip current swept several candidates far beyond their designated perimeter. Panic rippled through the unit as the men disappeared into the churning gray water, waves towering, visibility near zero. The safety boats scrambled, engines roaring against the tide, but conditions were brutal. Emily, stationed on one of the boats, didn't hesitate. She stripped her jacket off, clipped her rescue line, and dove headfirst into the freezing surf. The ocean swallowed her instantly, a violent wall of cold and chaos, but she cut through it with strong, precise strokes. The first candidate she reached was barely conscious, his arms limp, his face pale blue. Emily latched onto him, fighting the current with every ounce of strength. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she forced them both back toward the boat. Hands grabbed them, pulling them out of the water, but Emily was already turning back for the others. She dove again and again until all three men were accounted for. Her body felt like stone when she was finally hauled aboard, every muscle on fire, lips numb from the cold. Yet as she sat shivering on the deck, drenched and shaking, she saw the look in the rescued candidate's eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was reverence. They had seen death and she had pulled them back from it. Reese, standing at the bow, didn't say a word, but when they reached shore, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and steady. That touch said more than any speech could. From that day forward, the mocking nickname, SEAL's Helper, vanished from the base vocabulary. No one dared use it, not even in jest. Instead, her name carried weight in every conversation, whispered with the same respect they gave to decorated operators. Emily never asked for it, never flaunted it, but she carried it with quiet pride. She thought of Marcus often, how he would have laughed at her stubbornness, how he would have teased her for being recognized in a world that wasn't supposed to see her. But she also knew he would have been proud. For the first time, she didn't just feel like his sister. She felt like his equal. It was during a rare evening of calm that she allowed herself to feel it fully. The base was quiet, the surf pounding steadily in the distance, the smell of salt and fuel lingering in the air. Emily sat alone on the dock, her boots dangling over the water, the stars scattered across the sky like silver sparks. She thought of the men she had saved, the moments when her instincts had cut through chaos, the salute that had silenced 100 voices at once. She realized she was no longer living in Marcus's shadow. She was carrying his fire, but it had become her own flame, burning with its own strength. Still, a part of her knew this was only the beginning. Respect was fickle in the SEAL world. It had to be proved again and again, forged in fire each time. Emily wasn't afraid of that. She welcomed it. For she understood now, more than ever, that she wasn't there to prove herself to the men. She was there to prove something to herself, that she could walk into the harshest storms, into the fiercest ridicule, and emerge not as someone who had borrowed strength, but as someone who had built it in silence. And deep in her chest, where the ache of grief once sat heavy, there was something else now. Not just pride. Not just belonging. But purpose. The shift in Emily's life did not come with fanfare, medals, or announcements. It came in the quiet way people began to look to her without needing to be told. The candidates who once ignored her now sought her out after drills, not for easy comfort but for the kind of blunt, honest feedback she always gave. They realized she could see through excuses quicker than anyone, that she noticed small flaws in their discipline that others overlooked. One by one, they started asking her how to last longer in the surf, how to control panic underwater, how to keep steady when exhaustion blurred their vision. Emily never lectured. She spoke simply, repeating what Marcus had once drilled into her. Breathe steady, trust your body, fear is natural but it doesn't have to control you. Her words carried weight because they were not theories, they were truths forged in the same cold waters they endured. What struck the men most was not just her knowledge but her calm presence, a steadiness that grounded them when chaos tried to break them. But Emily's path was not without resistance. Not everyone in the chain of command welcomed her rising influence. Some senior officers outside of Reese's circle began to question why a civilian support staff member was becoming a figure of authority among candidates. Whispers of overstepping boundaries crept into official conversations. One evening, Emily was called into a briefing room where an administrative officer, sharp-eyed and formal, confronted her with carefully chosen words. "Ms. Hart, you are here as medical support, not as an instructor. Certain lines must remain clear." Emily stood at attention, hands clasped behind her back, her voice steady as she replied, "I've never asked to be treated as an instructor, sir. I've only done what was necessary to keep them alive." The officer's eyes narrowed, but before the moment stretched into reprimand, Reese stepped into the room. His presence cut the tension instantly. He regarded the officer coolly, then said, Hart does her job better than anyone. If you have a problem with results, take it up with me." The matter ended there. That night, as Emily walked back to her quarters, she felt the weight of Reese's words. He hadn't defended her out of favoritism, he wasn't the type. He had defended her because she had earned it. Still, she knew she had to be careful. Respect from the men was one thing, but institutional resistance was another. She reminded herself to keep her focus where it mattered most. The candidates, the mission, the lives that might one day depend on lessons they learned here. Her chance to prove that resolve came sooner than expected. During an advanced demolition drill, an accidental detonation sent shockwaves through the training field, knocking several men off their feet. Shouts filled the air as smoke and dust swallowed the clearing. Emily didn't hesitate. She ran into the chaos, ignoring the debris and the acrid stench, zeroing in on the cries of pain. One candidate lay clutching his chest, gasping for air, his ribs clearly broken. Another writhed with blood seeping from a deep cut along his thigh. Emily dropped to her knees between them, her mind already calculating priorities. Airway bleeding, shock. Her hands moved with lightning precision, applying pressure, issuing clipped commands to nearby men too stunned to react. "Hold his head steady. You, tear that shirt and give me strips. Now." The candidates obeyed instantly, their panic dissolving under the steel in her voice. Within minutes she stabilized both men, her clothes soaked in blood and sweat, but her composure unshaken. By the time the medics arrived, the crisis was under control. When the dust settled, the men who had witnessed her work gathered around in silence. The one with broken ribs, his face pale with pain, grabbed her wrist weakly and whispered, "You didn't even flinch." Emily only shook her head. "Flinching doesn't save lives." Her words spread quickly across the compound, repeated in hushed voices not as an anecdote but as a mantra. She had become, without seeking it, a symbol of resilience. Still, Emily wrestled with doubts in the privacy of her own thoughts. Late at night, when the compound quieted and the surf became the only sound, she wondered what Marcus would think of her now. Would he believe she had earned this place? Would he laugh at the idea of his little sister commanding respect among SEAL candidates? Or would he stand beside her silently, the way Reese did, acknowledging her without needing words? Sometimes she thought she could almost feel his presence, as if he were walking the beach with her, whispering the same steadying lines he used before missions. In those moments, she realized her journey was no longer about proving herself to the men. It was about proving herself to him, to the memory of the brother she had loved more fiercely than she could ever express. The next major test came with an extended survival exercise, one designed to break every illusion of comfort. Candidates were dropped into remote terrain with minimal supplies and ordered to endure for 72 hours under harsh conditions. Emily was embedded with the medical team, but the terrain was unforgiving, and soon she found herself in the thick of it alongside the men. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, fatigue clawed at their bones, and tempers flared in the darkness. Yet Emily never wavered. She rationed supplies with precision, stitched a torn gash on one man's arm under the dim glow of a flashlight, and when the rains came, she guided the group to high ground, her knowledge of survival instincts saving them from flooding that could have swept their camp away. The men looked at her differently after that, not as a medic or a helper, but as someone they instinctively followed. Even without rank, she was leading them. When they returned to base, battered and weary, Reese addressed them with clipped sentences as always. But then he stopped, his gaze lingering on Emily. "Every one of you survived because someone here refused to quit. Learn from that. Because when it matters, it won't be about how much you can lift or how far you can run. It'll be about whether you can keep going when everything around you tells you to stop." His words were aimed at the men, but everyone knew who he was speaking about. Emily stood silent at the edge of the formation, her heart heavy but steady, realizing that once again, without asking for it, she had become the example. Emily had never sought the weight that now pressed on her shoulders, yet it followed her everywhere she went. The men didn't just respect her anymore, they measured themselves against her. She could see it in the way they tightened their formations when she was near, the way they pushed harder during drills, determined not to collapse under her gaze. It was strange, almost surreal, that her quiet resilience had transformed into a force greater than any lecture or punishment. She knew the danger of this kind of influence. Reverence could curdle into resentment if she misstepped. So she kept her head down, worked harder than anyone, and carried her role with the same humility that had brought her this far. Still, there were whispers beyond the base, conversations Emily wasn't supposed to hear. Officers debating if she should be reassigned, if her presence blurred lines of command, if she was an exception that threatened the structure of the system. But every time doubt surfaced, she remembered Marcus's words: respect doesn't come from permission. It comes from refusing to be broken. The next trial came in the form of a classified joint operation simulation, one far more dangerous and unpredictable than any training Emily had seen before. She wasn't supposed to be part of it, but Reese insisted. If you're going to stay here, Hart, you're going to face the same storm the rest of us do. She accepted without hesitation. The scenario was designed to mimic a hostage rescue deep in hostile territory. The candidates would be tested not only on their tactical skills but on their ability to adapt when everything went wrong. Emily was assigned to medical support, but Reese gave her a look before they deployed that said everything. This would be more than patching wounds. It would test whether she truly belonged when chaos erupted. The mission began in darkness, helicopters cutting through the night sky as the team fast-roped into rough terrain. Emily landed hard, her knees jolting from the impact, but she rose quickly, scanning the perimeter. The candidates moved in formation, adrenaline sharp in their movements, and Emily shadowed them, silent and alert. The mock enemy compound was set in a valley, lit by dim strobes to simulate hostile searchlights. The team advanced, breaching walls, moving room to room with precision. For a while, everything went according to plan. But as Reese had warned, the exercise wasn't meant to stay under control. Explosions tore through the valley, smoke blinding, simulated gunfire echoing from hidden positions. Candidates stumbled, disoriented, some breaking formation, others freezing in fear. It was then Emily's instincts took over. She moved through the chaos with clarity that stunned even herself. One candidate panicked under heavy fire and bolted the wrong direction. Emily tackled him down, dragging him back to cover before he could be killed by the simulation. Another lay moaning from a shrapnel charge, his gear tangled, and she ripped it free, shouting for him to breathe steady while she pressed a compress to his bleeding shoulder. Her voice cut through the noise, not soft but commanding, the tone of someone who had no time for doubt. Even Reese, barking orders as rounds cracked around him, glanced her way and gave the barest nod of acknowledgement. She wasn't just surviving the simulation, she was leading within it. The exercise dragged on for hours, pushing every man to his breaking point. By the time the hostages were secured and the team began exfil, half the candidates were barely able to stand. Emily, her own body screaming with exhaustion, carried one man's pack on her shoulders while guiding another with a sprained ankle. Her arms trembled, her vision blurred, but she didn't falter. When the helicopter finally roared overhead for extraction, she pushed the men forward, one by one, refusing to climb aboard until everyone else was safe. Only then did she allow herself to collapse into the bird, her chest heaving, sweat dripping into her eyes. The candidates stared at her in silence, too drained to speak, but their eyes told the story. She had saved them, guided them, pulled them through what should have broken them. Back on base, Reese delivered his debrief in the harsh, unflinching tone he always used. He outlined every failure, every mistake, drilling lessons into the exhausted men. But when he finished, he turned to Emily, standing off to the side with her uniform stained and torn. His voice dropped lower, steadier. "You're not here because of Marcus. You're not here because of me. You're here because you've proven over and over that you can carry men when they can't carry themselves. And that is what makes a SEAL." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. For the first time, Emily felt the words hit her fully. She had stepped out of her brother's shadow entirely. She was no longer just a helper. She was something more, something that didn't even have a title yet but carried the same weight as any trident. That night, Emily lay awake staring at the ceiling, the echo of Reese's words still ringing in her ears. She thought of Marcus again, of the pride in his eyes when he told her she was tougher than she believed. She whispered softly into the darkness, "I made it, Marcus. Not as you, but as me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Instead, she smiled faintly because for the first time she felt she had honored him not by following his path but by forging her own. The days after the simulation shifted something permanent in the way the others treated Emily. No one called her the helper anymore, and no one dared joke that she was there by accident. Instead, men who once dismissed her now sought her out quietly, asking advice on managing exhaustion, asking how she kept calm under chaos, asking how she endured pain without breaking. She never boasted, never reminded them of what she had done, but her answers were steady, practical, rooted in experience rather than ego. The respect she had once begged for in silence was now given freely. Yet Emily knew she had not reached the end. The Navy had more trials, more gauntlets, and she would need to keep earning her place every single day. But the burden no longer felt as crushing because she Realized she had stopped trying to be Marcus and had finally become Emily, a fighter in her own right. Still, the officers had decisions to make. Behind closed doors, Reese and other commanders debated her future. Some argued she had proven herself beyond measure and should be allowed to continue integration into the unit. Others insisted that bending tradition would set a precedent the military wasn't ready for. Emily was aware of the tension but refused to be distracted by it. She rose before dawn, ran until her legs ached, drilled until her muscles screamed, and trained as if tomorrow was the day she would have to prove herself all over again. She knew one misstep, one moment of weakness, would be seized as evidence against her, so she left no room for excuses. Then came the memorial. A ceremony was being held for fallen SEALs of the last decade, names etched into stone, families invited to the base to honor them. Emily had mixed feelings as the day approached, because she knew Marcus's name was among them, and she had not stood before that wall since his death. When the morning came, the base assembled in perfect rows, uniforms sharp, sunlight glinting off medals and ribbons. Families sat quietly, clutching photographs, some holding folded flags against their chests. Emily stood near the rear at first, determined not to draw attention, but Reese motioned her forward until she was near the front ranks. Her pulse thundered as the admiral read the names, one after another, voices catching in the still air. When Marcus Hart's name was spoken, Emily's breath faltered. Memories slammed into her, the sound of his laugh, the way he had teased her when she doubted herself, the final phone call before his last mission. She bit her lip hard, holding back the tide. After the reading of names, an honor guard stepped forward to present arms. It was then that something happened Emily never expected. As the command was given, rifles raised in salute, she felt eyes shifting toward her. Slowly, deliberately, Reese stepped out of formation, turned sharply, and saluted directly at her. For a moment she froze, stunned, unsure if she had misunderstood. But then, one by one, other SEALs followed his lead, turning, lifting their hands, saluting not at the admiral, not at the stone wall, but at her. The air went still, even the family's whispering stopped. It was as if time itself paused to mark the moment. Emily felt heat rush to her face, her chest tightening so hard it hurt. She was no officer, no decorated veteran, yet these warriors who had mocked her as nothing more than a tag-along now gave her the gesture reserved for the highest respect. It was not just for her, it was for Marcus, for her fight to honor him, for the unbreakable spirit that had carried her through when she had every reason to quit. Her hands trembled, but she forced herself to return the salute, crisp and steady despite the tears blurring her eyes. When she lowered it, the silence broke into thunderous applause, not the polite clapping of a ceremony but the raw, unrestrained approval of men who had seen her earn her place. Families stood, some crying, some smiling through tears, and the admiral himself looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, pride, perhaps, mixed with acknowledgement of a reality too powerful to ignore. Emily's knees nearly buckled, but she stood tall, refusing to show weakness. She realized in that instant that her journey was no longer just about surviving training or proving herself to skeptics. It was about rewriting what people thought possible. When the ceremony ended, families approached her quietly, shaking her hand, thanking her for honoring their sons, husbands, brothers. One elderly woman pressed a photograph into her hand and whispered, "You remind me of him. Keep going for all of them." Emily held the picture tight, her throat aching with emotion. Later, Reese found her alone near the memorial wall. His voice, usually sharp and clipped, was low and firm. "They see you now, Hart. And more importantly, they see what's coming. Change doesn't happen because of speeches, it happens because someone refuses to break." That salute wasn't given lightly. "You've got more eyes on you than you realize." Emily nodded, unable to form words. For the first time she felt not like an intruder, not like a shadow of Marcus, but as someone worthy of carrying his legacy forward in her own way. That night, she sat on her bunk, staring at the photograph the old woman had given her. She whispered a promise to Marcus and to herself, that she would not let the salute be the peak of her story. It would be the beginning of something greater, something earned step by step, sacrifice by sacrifice. And for the first time since she had set foot on the base, she truly believed that when the next battle came, real or simulated, no one would see her as just a helper again. In the weeks that followed the memorial, Emily noticed a different weight in every glance she received. Where once she had sensed skepticism or quiet dismissal, now there was an acknowledgement, sometimes subtle, sometimes openly admiring, that she had crossed a line few thought possible. But she did not let herself be consumed by pride. She knew that respect was fragile, that every new challenge could strip it away if she faltered. She threw herself deeper into training, pushing harder than before, driven by a sense that her story was no longer her own. The salute had bound her to something larger, to the legacy of the men and women who had carried the trident before her, and to the families who had whispered thanks with tears in their eyes. Her muscles ached with constant effort, her lungs burned each dawn, but every step felt purposeful now. The commanders, though, were not blind to the shift. Behind closed doors, reports circulated, debates sharpened. Could Emily be allowed to continue? Would bending the structure of the Navy SEALs unravel traditions that had been cemented for generations? Reese argued in her favor with quiet persistence, pointing out that her results spoke louder than policy. Others hesitated, not from doubt of her ability, but from fear of what it meant for the future. Emily heard whispers but refused to listen. She could not control decisions made in rooms she would never enter. What she could control was effort, and she would never surrender that.